that I could understand that. And then I was on the House Corporation Board, so then I began to understand it more from that standpoint, the importance of capacity and financial elements of it. We've learned over time. And now the challenge is, where we used to try to make the rooms bigger and make the rooms more comfortable and a little bit almost suite-like. It's pretty common now, especially in sorority houses, to have a big TV in a room with a big sectional sofa and then maybe even some other rows of seating behind that.
What draws you to adaptive reuse projects like that? And can you share the challenges and creative solutions?
And even when you were trying to look at them on a computer screen and looking at the 3D model in Revit, it was hard for people to understand how they were really oriented to that.
All right, welcome to the On-Center podcast. On today's episode, we welcome Eric Rowland, a veteran architect and principal at Luminaut, whose career is defined by community-focused design, adaptive reuse, and a lasting impact on the built environment. Eric spent decades leading Roland Design, one of Indianapolis's oldest and most respected design firms, and guided it to award-winning heights before bringing that legacy to Luminaut through a recent acquisition. He's nationally recognized as an expert in Greek life housing, having designed or renovated more than 100 fraternity and sorority houses across the country. And he approaches each of those projects with a deliberate focus on community, believing that architecture should foster connection, leadership, and a strong sense of belonging. Beyond campus projects, Eric is passionate about adaptive reuse and sustainable design, breathing new life into historic buildings while preserving their character. Under his guidance, Roland Design earned honors like the AIA Indiana Firm of the Year Award, and he continues to champion innovative, community-centric solutions in the AEC industry. From reimagining student housing to revitalizing urban landmarks, get ready for an engaging conversation about Eric's design philosophy and the legacy he's building in architecture. And before we start, this episode is sponsored by Mapped. Mapped is a LiDAR reality capture partner that helps architects and builders streamline site data into usable 3D models and drawings, delivering accurate results faster and with far fewer headaches for your project team. Eric, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
I'm
Appreciate it.
excited to have you on here.
Serious intro there.
I did my research. I hope you noticed that.
Yeah.
Roland Design was a family firm started by your mother, Sally Rowland, over 50 years ago. You grew up with that legacy and eventually led the firm to award-winning heights before merging with Luminaut in 2021. Can you talk about your personal evolution from joining the family business to becoming the principal at Luminaut, and how did wearing both the architect's hat and the entrepreneur's hat shape your perspective on running a design practice?
Yeah, it was a fortunate situation to be able to do that. My wife and I originally lived up in Chicago, and I was working at the time. Well, I started out at Skid Rowings in Merrill, and then I moved to another firm called Ware Associates that did church design work around the country. They were kind of recognized as national experts in that field. And at the time, that field was really burgeoning, and they kind of threw me to the wolves. It was one of those things where I came in because they didn't have enough staff to handle all the projects that were coming in the door. And they kind of threw me in and gave me some projects to lead almost from the start. So kind of coming out of architectural school pretty green, it was trial by fire, and it really sort of, I guess, instilled the idea of just learn as you go and try to improve every step of the way from where you go there. So when my mom's interior design practice had started to kind of bump into practicing architecture without a license, I think they had been recognized as being really creative, and they would often partner with other design firms, architectural firms in town on projects. And that it was the same 1990 recession that I graduated into. Some of the architectural firms decided to just do interiors themselves. And so I think the decision was made by my mom that they would go ahead and bring architecture on board, and then see where we could go with it. So she obviously was an entrepreneur that I'd grown up with. I mean, she started the firm after my brother was born, and just decided that she thought she could do it. She had some good mentors and kind of pushed ahead. And for a while, it was a growth of, one new employee every year, and the projects kept growing. And so I kind of did the same thing when we started the architectural side as a business, since I'd learned so much at wear and trial by fire. I think I kind of came in with a pretty good sense of what needed to happen to get some things going. Um, and really the first project was renovation of the IPL headquarters on Monument Circle, which I did some of the design work moonlighting before we actually moved back to Indianapolis, and my license was still forthcoming from the state. And I finally got my stamp the day before we had to issue the drawings for that project. But from there, that was a great starting point, and it helped to uh, at least launch some visibility with what we wanted to do. The entrepreneurial part of it was not something I had to do just alone because coming in, there were four other partners in the firm beyond my mom, and so they had already built the interior side of the business pretty well, and they were able to give me good advice on how to nurture, bringing up the architectural side of the business. So but I feel like architecture is something where you kind of have to be kind of fearless and get in, and you got to believe in your ideas, and you got to sell your ideas, and that's sort of what you're doing as an entrepreneur as well.
For sure. So I can totally see how being thrown to the wolves would quickly build leadership skills. My question is, did being thrown to the wolves like that influence your leadership style at all?
Yeah, well, I'm sure it did. Maybe to the detriment of me being a great mentor to others. Because I've always sort of been like, "Well, get in and figure it out and do it." And I think to a degree it's been, just sort of set the example. I mean, sometimes I'm still like the last person in the office, and, there's a part of entrepreneurship and especially when your name's on the door, making sure things are going out the door the right way. And there's, unfortunately, it's no substitute sometimes to the hours that you have to put in. Sure. It's just there a lot of demands on time and figuring that out. And I was my background as an architect is a little bit unusual in that I started out as an economics major and an art minor in undergrad, and then went to architectural school to get my master's degree. So I think I think having that background, going to liberal arts school, I went to Wabash for undergrad. Um, it also, to a degree, set in my mind where architecture fit in the bigger picture. Because a lot of my friends were going to med school or law school or, into business and that kind of thing. And I think when you're focused just in architecture school, you just think, well, architecture is everything. And it's sort of like, well, you kind of have to see the bigger picture. And and I feel like architecture is probably one of the most liberal arts fields that you can be in. So, the ability to have the conversation with the doctors when you're working on a medical building, or to have the conversation with the lawyers when you're developing contracts and things like that are also part of the benefit from that.
I think architect's a great blend of both creative and scientific.
Yeah, there's so many niches in it that you can fit and find your comfort in, really.
It's one of my favorite things about the subject. The acquisition of Roland Design by Luminaut brought together two very creative forces: an Indianapolis studio with a 50-year legacy and a Cincinnati firm known for its vibrant culture. How have you approached blending the cultures and the teams of the two firms? And were there any lessons learned about leadership and firm culture through that transition?
Um, yeah, I mean, it's worked well. To a degree, they were pretty hands off with the acquisition in terms of a culture. I think there was, first of all, when we went through the process, we interviewed some other firms. You kind of go through this process where you talk to other companies and decide how does that feel. And as we went through that process, Luminat was hands down the best fit. I mean, their culture felt the most like our culture. The kinds of projects that they worked on were a really nice fit to some of the projects that we worked on, and to a degree, doing the fraternity and sorority work that I do, you know, learns and ties in a lot to the hospitality work and things that Luminat had expertise in. So from that standpoint, it's really been pretty seamless. Technology, because the merger occurred sort of right after COVID. So, we'd kind of gotten to a point where almost all firms were sometimes working remotely and, we learned how to use Teams and how to use Zoom and all that kind of stuff. So, to a degree, it felt more like we had always kind of been together anyway. Now, some elements did move to Cincinnati that we used to have in Indianapolis, but to a degree, it freed up, where I had to focus my attention so I could be a better mentor and really, um, the culture that we had already developed as Roland Design, I thought felt pretty consistent. We had to get used to new accounting systems and where the general notes go on the drawings and all those kinds of things. Some of those standards got worked through, but it really helped. I think both of us to learn a little bit from each other and how Sure did it. I think they recognized we built a practice and we kind of knew what we were doing, so they weren't going to come in and tell us how to change it.
Only after 50 years, I hope you don't.
No, exactly.
You've said where you live is a strong element of your sense of community. So Greek housing defines a community. In fact, one of your first projects was renovating your own fraternity house at Wabash College back in the 1990s. How did that experience, seeing how architecture can foster brotherhood, influence your design philosophy going forward? And more broadly, what core principles guide you when designing spaces intended to bring people together?
Um, One of the things that was unique about Wabash was the fact that the college relied, especially when I was there back in the 1980s, relied on the fraternities for student housing. So at the time that I was there, 80% of the men at Wabash were in a fraternity. And so, you kind of started out your first weekend going through Rush and then deciding where you were going to live. And so it was a pretty formative element for me as you start to develop your independence out of high school to find the people that I was comfortable with and find the things that we were comfortable doing. And I ended up joining a fraternity with a lot of great people in it. Very diverse group. That was one of the things that I learned about it, and it was one of the benefits, I think, of going through Rush so soon is that you didn't really have time to develop a preconceived notion of what those people were gonna be like. I mean, you could kinda see how they lived, but otherwise, you were just kind of, um, saying, "Okay, this one feels good," and then I've always been more of a visual learner, so just kind of watching and observing and seeing, how people lived in the house and what we did. And, we'd have card games and we'd have the, keggers on the weekends and you'd come back from class with the stereos blasting out the back window and people playing basketball in the parking lot and that kind of thing. And a lot of those elements kind of registered with me. So it was interesting to get the opportunity. I was the house manager of the fraternity too. So, in as the house manager for 2 years, you kind of learn also what the problems are that develop. Our house was robust in that it was all concrete walls, so I didn't have to patch a lot of drywall, but I did have to worry about people stealing the light bulbs out of the hallway lights for their desk lights and things like that. And so that gave me a little bit of a leg up in the marketing of going after fraternity and sorority projects, that I could understand that. And then I was on the house corporation board, so then I began to understand it more from that standpoint and the importance of capacity and financial elements of it. And so ironically now I've been hired by the college to renovate it again. So it's to a degree now we'll see how much I've learned over those since 2001 when we did that renovation, to go back because so much has changed in terms of how students live and, technology. I mean, I we had I had a Lisa when I was at Wabash, which is, sort of precursor to the Macintosh. And, so computers were just starting to come out when I was there. Now everybody's got iPads and laptops, and the problem is trying to get people off their screen. And now keggers are kind of a thing of the past. They don't do that like they used to. the national fraternity has a dry policy. How are we going to live in the house if you can't have a beer on Friday night and that kind of thing? And there is a lot that we've learned over time. And now the challenge is, where we used to try to make the rooms bigger and make the rooms more comfortable and a little bit almost suite like, to going back to maybe the rooms need to be more like little cells so they don't want to spend so much time in the room and you can get them out of the room.
Interesting.
Now,
Okay.
the challenge is, how do you get them out so that they're talking to each other? And for a while, there was an idea that everybody thought they were competing with independent housing. And so we're going to create rooms with their own bathroom. And it almost feels like a hotel or a room in the house. And I think now a lot have learned that that's not such a great idea, because a lot of discussions happen when you're taking a shower in the morning and talking to the guy in the next shower, or when you're brushing your teeth, or, doing those kinds of things. And now even mealtime isn't what it was when we were in school. It used to be we had crew that would bring the food to the tables and everybody sat at the table and sang a song and ate their food. And now it's always a buffet, and it goes from 11 o'clock to 1 o'clock, and people sort of come and go as they can.
Interesting.
So now we have to be very deliberate about getting opportunities for people to run into each other. And how are they gonna come in? Where's the university relative to the house? So are they gonna come in the back door or the side door or the front door? And then once they do that, how do you keep them from just making a beeline up to their room and finding a way for them to hang out and develop some relationships? How do you continue to have the basketball game and the stereos going, that kind of thing? So some of those amenities are starting to become bigger issues. The rooms that used to be the big party rooms now get treated more like they're, like a sports bar or something like that. And you can bring your laptop down and you can study and still have the game on or something like that. So we're trying to find some ways to do that.
So it sounds like a little bit of sociology is incorporated in architecture as well.
I should have been more of a psych major, probably, or econ major. I'm not sure.
That was pretty enlightening. I mean, the ideas that you brought up, is like nobody would think about that unless you're in charge of making sure that happens.
Yeah,
That's pretty cool.
it's a very deliberate thing, and yeah, because the other thing is you have to educate the alumni that are usually paying for some of the renovations. It's like it just doesn't work that way anymore, because they a lot of them all had the same sort of fondness that I had. If there were volunteers in their house, they usually were pretty involved, and but you still have to kind of convince them. It's like, well,
Just things aren't the way they used to
things
be.
have changed, and now, you're lucky if you get in the house for 1 semester or a semester and a half or something, because, everybody studies abroad now more so than they used to, and so your time in the house is shorter than it used to be, and it's really kinda harder to develop the relationships that if you're in the house for 4 years.
That's what frats are supposed to be about.
Right.
Yeah. Well, you're known as a national expert in Greek housing, and I can see why after this conversation. Having worked on over 100 fraternity and sorority houses, for example, at Butler University, you've helped sororities and fraternities renovate or build new houses with more amenities and capacity. What trends are you seeing in student life and campus that drive these projects, other than what we just talked about?
Yeah, and a lot of it is now there's been the public-private partnerships, especially at Butler. You can see that pretty easily, where they've hired outside developers to come in, and they've torn down the dorms and they're building new buildings that are more like apartment buildings. And so they do have suites and amenities, and so the competition in that regard is a little bit stiffer. But to a degree, I think there are elements of the Greek housing that you can use to sell. That just the idea of connectedness to more people, the idea of walking home after class to a beautiful house and coming into a living room as opposed to coming into a lobby of an apartment building. There's some different psychology of that sense of welcome, and I'm so happy that I live here, and then just getting to go hang out with some of your friends in the dining room or go shooting some hoops in the back. So it is, kind of some of the things that we've already mentioned, the idea of of just comfortable spaces to get them out of their rooms, so that they'll have that kind of interaction. Furniture is a big part of it. That's continues to be one of the advantages too that we've had as a firm is since it was started as an interior design firm, the idea of procurement of furnishings and who good sources are. What we have to specify for a sorority is very different than what we'll specify for a fraternity. They're a lot harder on the furniture in a fraternity than they are in the sorority, but at the same time, stupid things like do the pillows fall off the sofa or the seat backs and all that kind of stuff, So there's things that you think about. I think about as even as the house manager part of me too is like, how hard is it going to be to clean it up? How nice and welcoming is it going to look when you come into it? Um, the idea of a nice staircase to go up and, what are you going to see when you look out the windows? It's just a lot of little details that I think make a Greek house feel a lot different than more generic university housing project.
Sure.
Um, Food service is a big part of it too. The dining room and the kitchen and the servery and having food just you can go grab something and it's not tied to a food contract or something like that. So you can welcome your friends over. Let's grab a pizza or something. Sure.
How do you balance preserving a chapter's traditions with updating their houses for today's students with the study pods, technology, privacy needs, etc.?
Yeah. Well, lots of plugs. Everybody needs to have that. So I would say the rooms that have changed the most, well, cold air dorms kind of aren't there anymore. And so we've done a lot to, in some cases,
Cold air dorm. I'm sorry.
a lot of historically, and it's a tradition in a lot of houses. And I don't know to what degree it was really driven by the Board of Health. That's what we were always told. But like our house, the 4th floor was the dorm, and that's all that was up there, and you kept the windows open even in the wintertime, so the air blew through, and it was, the advantage being presumably that the cold weather, you slept better, and somehow all the breeze was keeping the germs out or something. I'm not sure exactly how it works, but, that was the time back in the '70s and '80s, and, there were some advantages to it in that you could keep that area quiet and people could sleep and not be disturbed. It was easier to say the rules are no talking when you get in there, the lights stay off, that kind of thing, as opposed to when you're sleeping in your room and your roommate's still maybe studying for an exam or something like that, where it starts to become a little bit, and maybe the guys in the room next door are having a party, so it's a little bit more difficult, when people are sleeping in their rooms to really enforce quiet. Um, but a lot of times now, and I would still say even a lot of the older fraternities that we do, and a lot you think that they'd want to do away altogether with the cold air dorms, and that hasn't always been the case. In many cases, we keep part of it, but there is definitely more interest in people being able to sleep in their rooms, and that's evolved a lot. We're doing a house right now at IU where we're specifically designing the room so there's a sleeping end of the room with the beds built in, and that's next to the sleeping end of the room for the other house, and there's a way you can close that off from the rest of the room, so you can better control the quiet element of it. Um, but a lot of times now it's a furniture change in the living room where what used to be a formal living room, now you'll find ways to put in study niches. You may have more furniture that has built-in plugs, sometimes induction chargers on the tabletops and things like that. Certainly the case in dining rooms now, where we have a lot more banquettes. You can pull tables together for study groups and things like that. With post-COVID, especially, we now are putting in a lot of rooms that are sound isolated rooms with nice backdrops so that you can have Zoom meetings and Zoom calls in a quiet area of the house. If you're interviewing for a job, which a lot of people are doing now over Zoom, trying to think about some amenity spaces like that.
Gotcha. Um, we've touched on it a bit already. I was intrigued by your approach to combating the heads and phones problem among students. You intentionally placed common areas like study lounges and dining rooms near front entries of Greek houses to spark impromptu interactions, like the living room as opposed to the lobby that you mentioned. Have you actually seen this strategy work? And do you think architects have a responsibility to design for social engagement?
Oh, absolutely. I think no matter what you do, I mean, architecture is such an evolution of what the social world is like, that you've got to pay some attention to what that environment is. It it is always evolving. I do think it works. I mean, we I think we've gotten enough repeat business from some of our clients that they seem to think that it works as well. Um, we're trying to stay ahead of technology in some ways. A lot of that stuff is still evolving. It'll be interesting to see now with, like I've got a Vision Pro and, 3D headsets and things like that, where now you can start to have multiple people in the same virtual environment. And, what's that going to do? Are people going to really want to do it? One it's pretty common now, especially in sorority, houses to have a big TV in a room with a big sectional sofa and then maybe even some other rows of seating behind that, so that all the women can get together to watch The Bachelor or something like that. You know, for guys, it's, making sure there's a TV in the dining room so you can watch a football game or something while you're having your pizza. Definitely technology is infiltrating from that standpoint a lot more than it did when I was in school. We had one TV in the basement with MTV on, um, and and, that did draw people in. It was a social thing, but it's a little less, less so than it is now. So we're trying to do that. We do a lot of gaming, spaces now because a lot of, especially again in the fraternities, maybe more than the sororities, but, like, we'll instead of everybody, because now it's easy to put a big screen TV in your room. They're flat, they don't take up a lot of space, you can stick it on the wall. But we don't want them to do that. We'd rather have them come outside and do it with some other people. So we're working to do some of that kind of stuff. And again, it seems to work. I mean, we'll go back and visit houses and people are generally using the spaces the way we thought they would. Lambda Chi House at Butler is a good example. I've been there several times since we designed it, and there's always a group of people hanging in the living room and a group of people hanging out in the dining room, and that was exactly what we were hoping would happen.
That's gotta be quite validating.
It is.
Whether or not you need valid
And that they're making good memories.
yeah.
It's that house was unique in that they wanted it to look like their old house because they had made a deal with the university. The university bought their old house, and so we built their new house, on a different site, on a different lot, but they wanted it to still have the vibe that their old house had to bring that tradition in. And, when you talk about technology too, another thing that we've done in a few instances, and it's, I think, becoming more prevalent is with, digital print wall covering and things like that. You can scan some of their historic documents or you can scan images of some of their notable alumni or some things like that. And you can actually create, in their library or something like that, a wall covering that isn't going to get damaged because you can scrub it. It's just printed on vinyl, but it helps them tell the story or reminds them of some of the history of their chapter, and it helps to make that connection with some of the older alumni and generations, and helps in recruiting a little bit. We're also starting to see composites get digitized now, so you can just have instead of having the composite of everybody is in the house now in the front hall, you have a digital screen. And so now when alumni come back, they can find theirs because it's not lost in an attic somewhere. And when they're doing it, they can be updated. They can tap on somebody's image. It'll tell them what their email address is or how to reach them,
Oh, that's really neat.
kind of thing. So that's kind of nice technology that's helping the tradition get a little bit more embedded in the house.
Sure. Old buildings to me are I love doing historic preservation work, are really interesting and can adapt themselves pretty well for reuse most of the time. Um, You've noted this. Your work on the Ryan Fire Protection Training Center, turning a derelict historic building into a high-tech learning facility, is a great example. What draws you to adaptive reuse projects like that? And can you share the challenges and creative solutions from the Ryan project, for instance, more broadly?
Oh, absolutely. Um, it's a history, right? And a building, I mean, I appreciate this as an architect and the clients as well. I mean, the whole process of designing a building and bringing it into reality, it involves hundreds of people often.
Sure.
And there's a lot that's embedded in that. And, I think if in many cases, when the craftsmanship was really carefully thought out and the design was really carefully thought out, you see some of those things over time. And it's always a shame to lose that because somebody couldn't think creatively about how to reuse it, or, if the space has changed. Um, there's a building, or How Buildings Learn by Stuart Brand is a really interesting book to look at, that talks about some of those kinds of things, how buildings evolve over time and the different uses and what they bring to the building. And some buildings that don't look like much have survived because they're easily adapted to new technologies, and some buildings that were really beautiful, but didn't adapt to the environment that's changing around it, have to be destroyed, and something new comes into their place. But in that, there's so much that's embedded in that. I always like to start first and see what we can salvage, what was really the key elements of it, and where do we go with that. And the Ryan Fire Protection Building, it's interesting that happened. Really, I it was a building I used to drive by all the time, and I loved the brick facade on it. And it actually, I think, was, it was, Indianapolis Rubber Stamp originally, which is where I picked up my registration stamp when I needed it to stamp the drawings for the Palco building on Monument Circle. But I always admired the quality of the brickwork and the creativity that went into the pattern of it. And, when I got the call from Ryan that they were interested in looking at it and trying to figure out how to turn it into their training center, was a fascinating challenge. I went in, and of course, what we found out is the facade was beautiful, but kind of the rest of it had been over time, uh, used leaks in the roof, sure, yeah, not necessarily well maintained. Um, but it had an order tool that was pretty interesting, and we chose to highlight that with the structural columns. That it was a largely column-free space, but then there was one row of columns, and we chose to paint those red, and then we grazed them with lighting that was tight to it, so you could see all the thickness of the layers of paint that had been on it over time, and that texture became kind of an interesting element of the story to go along with the facade, which we did repoint and cleaned up. And they were great clients to work with, and that they're involved in construction all the time, so they kinda knew a lot about what the process was, and so they were really open to, like, how do we show off what we do? This is our training center, and, usually, the risers you hide, in a utility room somewhere, and in this case, y first of all, they wanted to use them to train, and so there were several different kinds of risers that they might find in different kinds of installations, so we had a series of them. And then we pulled them away from the wall. We put a skylight on the wall so that they were highlighted and you could really see them brightly. And then we put a butt glazed wall into that space so that anybody that walked down the hall in the building was going to see, this is what we do, and this is what we do here. And of course, the irony was, by code, the building didn't have to have a sprinkler system, but when you're doing it for the sprinkler system company, you got to put a sprinkler system in. So we wanted to really show that off, and we ended up taking the elements of a sprinkler system and creating some screens. So the pipes that usually are painted red and hidden in the ceiling, we used vertically and used the sprinkler heads as decorative elements throughout some of those screens in the building as well. Opened up training spaces to some recreation spaces as well, so you could kind of chill and relax in part of it, and they wanted to use it to develop some of their culture, to kinda show off what their culture could be, and they're a great place to work, so.
I'm glad you mentioned the risers because if you hadn't, I was going to ask you about that specifically. I thought it was a brilliant idea. That was really cool. That was really cool. Um, on the podcast here, we love to explore where architecture meets technology because we're a tech company. You're in architecture. How is Luminaut incorporating new technologies into your design process or final buildings? For example, are you using any cutting edge tools like virtual reality for client presentations? You mentioned you had those goggles. Computational design, sustainable building tech. Are you using any of those in your projects, and how?
Oh, yeah. I've always been a tech geek. I mean, as I said, I had a Lisa when I was in college, and that was a pretty high-end machine back in the day, and that evolved into a Mac 2 when I was in architecture school, and so I've always appreciated and tried to be a pretty early adopter of the technology, as it's evolving. It seems to make sense, and, you learn some things that work and some things that don't work, and even when I was at, Ware Associates up in Chicago, well, certainly SOM was awesome because, at SOM, they had their own proprietary CAD system that they developed at the time, and when I was at SOM, I was working on what was the Spiegel headquarters, but you literally could develop the model in the computer, and you could hit send, and it would send the model to the, model shop that they had, and then their model shop had computer-driven lathes that would take a block of plexiglass and carve a model of the building that you had just done out of it, and so you do that, and a couple days later, they plop the model on your desk so you could see what you were doing, and that was, to me, just a really fascinating that that technology would go that way. So I was a pretty early adopter of 3D printing, and we've used that when we were doing the Liberty Fund headquarters up in Carmel. They had some the structural columns that we designed for that building were pretty complicated, and even when you were trying to look at them on a computer screen and looking at um, the 3D model in Revit, it was hard for people to understand how they were really oriented to that, and so there was still, like, a benefit to being able to just print out that column so you could sit it on the table, and then when you're talking to the engineers, it's like, "This is the part that we're looking at," and it that worked really well. As far as sustainability goes, I was LEED accredited pretty early on when LEED came out, and that's something that I've always um, kind of explored around with. You learn a lot. I've done a lot of it either on my own house or on our office, where you try to like I have a green roof on my kitchen addition on my house, for instance, because I thought it was cool. I remember my parents sending me a postcard of in Norway grass roofs on some of the buildings there. And so I was always kind of intrigued, even as a kid, about planting stuff on your roof. And it makes sense. Some of what they sell you on is, they're like, "Oh, no, it won't gather weeds." Bull. It's like, so, I've learned I'm not going to try to sell it to a client and say that you don't have to get up there and pull weeds because you do. You have to have somebody do that. That's interesting. But the dandelions make it everywhere. So it doesn't matter how dense your uh, growth is on your roof. The dandelions are going to find a way. But, but like I've learned cork floors, don't do very well, but there's a southern exposure and they bleach out too quickly and some things like that. But generally, even if we're not doing a LEED accredited building, we're going to use sustainability test. We're going to go through the checklist, which has evolved over time as LEED has. But, you'll still look at the checklist and say, let's do this. This is an easy thing to do. Let's do this. And we'll use that as a guideline. Passive solar stuff, is kind of a no-brainer in a lot of cases. How you site a building sometimes has some pretty strong impact, so we like to look at that. So we do always now start out as a 3D model, and you can play and push and pull. Typically, our process is to start with SketchUp because that's the software that I'm most familiar with, and it works pretty easily from a schematic design standpoint, and then, move from SketchUp into Revit to get the final documentation out. But even SketchUp has evolved, so you can use it to do lighting studies and that kind of thing. Um, and then staying on top of things like the changes in lighting, especially. Nobody has to worry about anybody stealing the light bulbs out of the hallway for their desk lights anymore because they've got LED desk lights. If they're not wearing a headband that has that in there, and now you've got LED lights in the hallway, so there's no light bulbs to steal. But that technology has evolved a lot since I've been practicing in the last 20 years. Um, and what you can do with lighting is a
Oh,
lot
yeah,
more interesting now than what you used to be able
for
to
sure.
do. MEP systems, we're reliant a lot on our consultants to keep us abreast of what the latest and greatest is on that. Um, with Greek housing, we've kind of gone through phases as to whether you want to use split systems or not, and some things like that. Um, just because now they've been out long enough that you can tell whether they're doing what they were promised to do or not. And so we're kind of going back to simpler systems again, I think, as opposed to doing a lot of the split systems. Um, uh, and then building materials themselves, glass has come a long way in terms of what you can do with it. So I think tech always has to be a big part of what you do. Like what you do, the scanning stuff is also fascinating, and that's evolved from used to walk around with um, Canvas, I think was the name of the software, and yeah, you would stick a lidar on the back of your iPad, and you could sort of scan a space to get a start, and that was a huge advantage over tape measures and carrying
Oh, for sure.
off, to go around and do that. And now that's gotten so much more precise. And again, now that we do so much work remotely, it's like pretty common now to do a scan of a building for a fraternity or sorority because now they have members of the house corporation board that are all over the place, and you can just walk them through a model and say, "This is what we're talking about. We're here," and that kind of thing. It's pretty,
We did a few during the summer last year,
yeah.
yeah, when school was out. So it was pretty interesting. I think last year was the first year we'd done, Greek housing. It was pretty fascinating. I got, like, 3 right in a row. It was pretty cool.
Get the smell across and the pretty scans, yeah.
It's nothing compared to assisted living housing.
Oh, well, I suppose that's true.
Luminaut prides itself on a people-centric collaborative culture. Talent is nurtured, ideas are born. In your studio as principal, how do you nurture young architects and designers on your team? I know you've continued initiatives like the Sally Rowland Bright Future Scholarship to help students breaking into architecture, but why is mentorship and supporting the next generation so important to you?
Well, I think a lot was lost during COVID a little bit when people weren't in the office all the time. I think one of the best ways for people to learn is through observation and through overhearing the conversations and being able to sort of, grab a conversation or say, okay, how did that come up? And, you can almost do like a real time mentorship while you're in the studio, which is something that you wouldn't be able to do necessarily when everybody's working remotely.
For sure.
Um, uh, I think a big, part of it is encouraging people to be fearless and get out and figure things out. Um, at least from my standpoint, that's how I learn. And so we've got some people in our office that are really involved in AIAS and the Young Architects Forum um, to to um, to start to develop some leadership through that. I was fortunate to go through the Stanley K. Lacey leadership series, and I made a bunch of good friends and some clients through that process as well. So I'm always encouraging them to get involved in groups outside the office that they have passionate interest in. Right now, I'm the president of the Design Arts Collaborative over at the Indianapolis Arts Center, and that's a group that's a pretty fascinating group that we're trying to develop and encourage people to participate in with some events that are specific forums to talk about design, but beyond just architecture, landscape design. We've got the head designer for uh, Delta Faucet is gonna come in and do a presentation, and so I'm, encouraging, people in the office to get involved in doing some of those kinds of things as well, but part of being the entrepreneur and doing uh, trying to grow the business is really you do have to get involved in interests that are outside of architecture.
For sure.
And you're not going to get a lot of work from other architects. I mean, you might partner to get something, but it's like when you're at church and talking to people, or when you're involved in Kiwanis and talking to people, or other kinds of organizations, you can help help those people understand what architects really do. Because I think for people that aren't architects, it's a mystery. And I think you can also then add organizational capabilities to those organizations. You can help them see things a little bit differently. And then ultimately, you may get some more work out of that project too. I think for a while, we've done a ton of not for profit offices and been involved in that. United Way of Central Indiana, we did their offices. We've done work at cleaners. And some of those are a result of being volunteer in those areas.
That's cool. I've actually overheard conversations of young architects at AIA where they get together, just a bunch of young ones, college students or just out of college, and trying to strategize on how to make the best use of their time at an AIA reading. Well, I've actually heard that. I've heard that conversation. Um, you haven't just led within your firm. You've been active in broader industry and civic roles, like you just mentioned, from serving as vice president of AIA Indianapolis to sitting on.
President, actually.
You were president as well.
Yeah.
You got to be vice president before you're president, so I'm still right. To sitting on Indiana Landmarks board and even volunteering with community nonprofits. How have these external leadership experiences influenced you as an architect? And do roles like these change the way you view the impact of architecture on communities?
I do think it kind of goes back to the idea of the liberal arts aspect of architecture and how it fits kind of in the bigger picture. It's, I- you know, architects are such a small percentage of what the population of the world is. And a lot of people look at architects as skeptical and they're just adding another layer or something. But I do think there's a lot of value that we bring to a design process.
Absolutely.
And whether it's a small design process, I mean, like right now, we're worried about how this swimming pool in our neighborhood is going to work and where the pumps need to go. And there's elements that I think a lot of people don't consider, where an architect has the bigger vision to say, well, if you do that, here's what the problem is going to be down the line when you try to use this part of the property, or if you're going to add a splash pond, now you're at the wrong end of the pool to do that, or some things like that. So, so I feel like getting involved in those kinds of organizations again um, helps you realize where we fit in the big picture, but it also gives us the opportunity to educate a little bit of what we do, and ultimately architecture's, I think, still a relationship-based thing. They people need to trust you. They need to see that you're thoughtful about how you go about doing things. It's got a big social element to it, and just kind of developing and nurturing friendships to a degree is a parallel to developing and nurturing the design of a building. So um, I like getting out of the building part of it a little bit and focusing on the people part of it, as well. I think, to me, it's also, and it's not just the community organizations; those are important, but it's also your family. Like going home and spending time with your wife and your kids, and how all that fits in the big picture too. Because I think you can practice architecture to your detriment if you get too far along. I know a lot of architects that have gotten divorced or don't have strong relationships with their kids, and I feel like you got to understand the bigger picture of what all's going on, and is it worth it to take the building that much?
Well, I know you guys work your butts off in college,
Yeah,
and I think that might be where a lot of that mentality, that work ethic comes from.
it is.
So is that something you had to unlearn?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Well, and or you change your schedule, especially I haven't done it as much lately, although probably the last all-nighter I pulled was maybe I probably pulled one within the last year, but
Really?
it used to be, that you would do all-nighters on a regular basis, but I still set the rule with my family that I would I would be home at 6 o'clock for dinner. We would, have dinner, play with the kids, do whatever we needed to do, and then as soon as they go to bed, I'd go back to the office to keep going on something if I needed to do that. So
Well, it's obviously been a successful approach for you, so
yeah, yeah. Although my wife will argue that still spent too much time at the office, but
but you're still together.
we're still together
Exactly.
5 years. So yeah, no, in the end, I think it's turned out well. Yeah.
Well, I discovered that, during grad school, you received a fellowship to study how people inhabit public places in Europe,
Right.
and you've applied social observations to design ever since. You once remodeled your own kitchen as a green design experiment. You mentioned that with the green
Yeah.
roof. Are there any other formative experiences or lesser known projects in your life that significantly shaped your outlook on design?
Yeah, that was a real surprise when I got that fellowship. It was not something that I applied for, and it was a nice honor to be recognized. And it did that. When I think about some of this stuff, because what I had to do was once they honored me with the fellowship, I had to decide what I wanted to do. And I'd always been fascinated with William White and his observations on how people react to public spaces. And to a degree, I still take what I learned from that fellowship to a lot of what we've talked about in terms of the Greek housing and how people want to hang out in the fraternity house and how do you think they're going to react. So that was a good psychological one. Um, I'm trying to think if there's I mean there's been so many. It was one of the things that I did prior to that that has also made a strong impression. I really like to sail, and, so I decided, when I was the University of Illinois had a study abroad program in Versailles, and, they gave us the whole month of April as a travel break, and it basically you had to program what you wanted to do during that break, and so for 2 weeks of that break I decided it was an excuse to charter a sailboat and take some of the architecture students to sail through the Greek islands. And we put it on the premise of we're going to study Greek architecture from the water side and how that influenced as we sailed through the islands. And
Sounds like hard work.
it was a really fascinating trip because it started out and we chartered the boat out of Athens and we sailed down to the southern tip of Greece to go out to the Middle Cyclades. And they told us, be careful when you get to the southern tip of Greece because the winds can, sort of surprise you when you get into that part of the Mediterranean. And sure enough, as we sailed down in it, we started out and it was beautiful sailing. It was warm. People were laying on the deck, just kind of chilling out and enjoying a great start to the trip. And then we got to that southern tip and a squall was coming through when
Oh, wow.
and it was, like it was a quick jolt to the sailboats as, a couple people's drinks popped into the water, but it was like, oh wow, okay, sailing's not all this pretty stuff. And we ended up uh, because it was so, strong and it was a storm, and this was again before the internet, you didn't really know what the weather predictions and things were gonna be. So we reefed the sails, we went into, a cove on the southern tip of the Greek mainland, and, um, and it was so bad that we decided we were gonna have to pull an all-nighter just to make sure that the anchor didn't release, and so we set up watch. It was a really good teamwork effort from the development of that, but as we were going in, a Greek fishing boat capsized
Oh,
right
no.
next to us, and it wasn't something that we couldn't really risk our own crew to go help them out, and fortunately, they were fine 'cause I radioed to the Greek Coast Guard, and they said, "What do you want us to do about it?" And I'm like, "Oh, okay, I guess we're really on it to air." It's like, um but, the next day, still bad winds blowing, and we went around to another marina that was still on the Greek mainland, and one of the people that was on the boat decided, "I've had enough." But what was interesting that night, the Temple of Poseidon was up on top of the hill, and it was just kind of this dark, menacing Greek ruin that we saw up there, and that as everybody was taking turns with watch, that was sort of the haunting image that everybody had. And then slowly after we dropped one of the participants off, the weather kind of got slowly better as we went through the islands, and then we finally got to, I think it was Mykonos, and then on the way back, it started to become warm and really pleasant again. And our last night, we decided to anchor in that same um, port again, and and they were filming a music video at the Temple of Poseidon, and it was the nicest, most pleasant, most beautiful night that you could imagine. And they had it brightly lit, and you could hear the musicians up there, and it was just like the reminder of the best of times and the worst of times that you can see when you're sailing. And so that always has also been something that I've kept in my mind, as you go through frustration with bringing in work or business or a project's, headed south or something like that. It's just like the reminder of it just kind of wait it out, that it will change. So, not as much an impression on architecture as it maybe is on the entrepreneurial element.
Sure. What a great story.
So it was fascinating. Yeah, really fun.
That's a fantastic story. I don't know if you can top that. But I was gonna ask, and this that totally qualifies. What's a story from your journey that many may not know? And like I said, that last story may qualify.
One of them, a few people know that one.
But are there any others that that had an outsized influence on the architect and leader that you are today? Besides Poseidon watching over you through storm and
I mean, so much of it is just people I've gotten to know. I mean, I think the SKL thing was another one that made a huge impression on me. Some people that have participated in it know, but it was really for me. It was helpful to help me feel more enthusiastic about being in Indianapolis specifically. I'm kind of a big city person, and so that was the hard part about moving from Chicago back to Indianapolis was, sort of missing out on just the excitement and some of the culture events and Lake Michigan and better sailing and some of those kinds of things that Chicago offered. But, to find that there was a really cool group of people that I got along well with, and, that went a long way, I think, to reinforcing my confidence and how we would build the business, I think, a little bit.
I'd like to think that Minneapolis has improved since that time.
It has. Oh, absolutely. And, the upside is you actually feel like you make a difference in Indianapolis.
That's fair.
Chicago is so big that you don't, even if you do something substantial, it's like, oh, it's another high rise, whatever. Whereas here it's a
It's a big deal. Yeah.
and it's a small town. People, right? Like if you didn't do it yourself, the people that did, and that kind of thing. And I've yes, definitely come to appreciate it more. I mean, I still get to a lot of Cubs games, so I get my fix on the big city from Friday afternoon at 1:20 road trips and that kind of thing. But it's a great town, and a lot of my friends from Chicago, as they've come to visit, they sort of understand why we made the move. It's a great place to live, and especially once you start to have kids, it's easier.
Very cool. Eric, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, your insights, and those really cool stories. I appreciate you being on my podcast.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much.